All right, as I see attendees coming into the webinar, I'm going to get things kicked off here. Good afternoon. Welcome to the latest in our series of ENO Center for Transportation webinars. As you all know, ENO is an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank. We are currently celebrating our 100th year as an organization, which has been very exciting. I encourage everyone to check out our 100-year website at 100years.enotrans.org to see some of the interactive elements that we have going on. My name is Paul Lewis. I'm the policy director here at ENO, and today on this webinar, we are discussing guiding the new UAS industry to safety excellence, which is coincidentally also the title of our newest paper, and we're going to be discussing the contents of that paper. And just for a little context, the point here is that we want to recognize that the aviation industry and regulators are achieving a lot of notable successes in creating effective policies to facilitate the integration of UAS into the National Airspace System. But we've identified a couple gaps that have yet to be resolved. And the first of those is establishing a safety culture among all users and using that as a stepping stone for safety management systems, particularly for commercial users of UAS. And this coincides nicely with some announcements and news coming out of the Federal Aviation Administration, where they are planning to require all Part 135 carriers, Part 145 repair stations, and Part 91 air tour operators to implement SMS, as well as our recommendations for the UAS industry. So this coincides well with that, and our discussion is going to talk a little bit about how this all meshes, and how now is really the time to proactively establish a smart and effective UAS safety culture and SMS policies that work for both commercial and recreational UAS users. So we'll talk about how Congress and the USDOT can harness resources already in place to establish this, and how these proactive measures create a sustainable and rich safety culture and traditions for the entire UAS industry. We have the paper's author, Ken Dunlap, with us. Ken is the managing partner at Catalyst Go and has been leading a lot of the research in UAS here at ENO for the past 2.5 years, and really happy to have him with us and presenting today. So the format, just for a little housekeeping, is a presentation followed by a discussion. So Ken will present here a couple slides, and then after that, we're going to have you type some questions into the question function on your control panel. So once you have a question, please enter it there either during the discussion or afterwards. If you have any tech issues, we found the best thing to do is to leave the webinar and then come back in, and that seems to resolve most issues. And just as another note, we will be sending a copy of this slide deck as well as a recording to all of those that have registered to this once the webinar is finished. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ken, who's going to walk through our slides. Let's see, Ken, are you there?
I am here.
All right.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Paul, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm going to start out with a comic, and it's from Gary Larson, the author of The Far Side. Some of you may have seen this, some of you may not have seen it. But in this comic, we have two pilots talking to one another, and one says to the other, "Say, what's a mountain goat doing way up here in a cloud bank?" And I think this profound little comic tells us everything we need to know about today's topic. And it says, if you find yourself in this position, you're essentially out of options. And safety culture and safety management systems are two of the best tools to keep this from happening to you. Let's talk about a couple of definitions to set the stage. So what is safety culture? Well, that's an intangible. It's kind of a touchy-feely thing, and that's the attitudes and the perspectives that you bring to the job. And that could be your own personal attitudes, or it could even be corporate attitudes, because companies have personalities as well. safety management systems, or what I'm going to refer to as SMS for shorthand during the course of this conversation, are processes and guidance that you can audit. And a company uses safety management systems to drive its safety mission, beginning literally on the ramp or in someone's backyard or in the front yard, and take that all the way up to the boardroom. So it's an end-to-end process that touches every end of your organization. And SMS is actually, it's a book or a manual that you're going to find on someone's desk. So SMS, or safety management systems, is the tangible part of this conversation. So next slide, please. As we get there. So safety culture and SMS have a couple of important roles, and that's to help people and organizations address what's unexpected, define attitudes and approaches to resolving risk. So how do we approach this problem and how do we solve it? But also how you can operate safely day to day in the field. And I guess the big question is, so why are we talking about safety culture and SMS for UAS? I know everyone's familiar with the paradigm of the iceberg. And it's always what you don't see that can harm you. It's never what's above the line that can harm you, because you can avoid it. And so safety culture and SMS help you plan for what's below the waterline. It helps you assess risks, plan alternate approaches, and most importantly, it can guide your action should the unexpected occur. And our research shows that right now, the near totality of the UAS industry, except for maybe some manufacturers and some certificate holders, are not equipped to deal with what's below the waterline, what's beneath the iceberg you see. We are good at seeing clearly what's in front of us, but the tools that we really need are for encountering the unexpected. And maybe the question is, well, why not in UAS? Well, first off, safety culture and SMS are not part of UAS right now because it's a new industry. These two tools take time to roll out, to develop, and to use, and to make part of your day-to-day approach to safety. And also, there hasn't been a trigger event. And we'll talk a little bit more about trigger events as we go on. So the big question is, who uses safety culture? Is this about aviation? No, it's not about aviation. In fact, it's about industries that have embraced a new way of doing things with safety. And so safety culture is used by the power industry, by healthcare, by airlines, in this case, Part 21 air carriers, which are the airlines you and I fly on. It's used by SMS. It's used by rapid transit, and it's also used by rail. And that's just to name a few industries. It's used widely across industries today. And then the next question would be, who endorses it? I could literally put about 100 logos at the bottom of this slide, but I've chosen just a few, and I'd like to draw your attention to three in particular. SMS and safety culture is endorsed by the US Department of Transportation, by the Federal Aviation Administration, and the National Transportation Safety Board. But there are a number of NGOs who endorse it as well. So, the key takeaway is safety culture is bigger than just aviation. Next slide, please. So let's jump into some of the key takeaways of the report just right away. Some of these are obvious, some of these are not so obvious, and a couple of them are really surprising and shocking, and I can't believe I've had to write these down on this slide, but we have to. So let's talk about the first takeaway, and that's this. An accident is going to trigger a reflexive and possibly irreversible series of mandates. And we've seen this with the tragedies of the Boeing 737 MAX, Colgan Air, and also with the MAP 21 highway legislation that's being overseen by the Federal Highway Administration. But the real point on this is safety culture and SMS are well understood by Congress, they're well understood by the regulators, and the language to implement these, in fact, almost immediately, is there right now, and it's being used, and it has been used over the last 10 to 15 years. So if an accident happens, that language is ready to go. Next, and this is probably the most surprising thing I'm going to share with you today, and it's this. So we know as people, safety should be everybody's responsibility. And in the case of the UAS industry, that safety is a responsibility of every user. But what the research showed that is totally shocking is that very few involved in the UAS industry understand their role. And you're probably scratching your head wondering, well, why is that? Well, I think what we need to do is take off our inside the beltway hats for a minute and take a look at the process of how an individual or a corporation buys a UAS. And I'm talking UAS from something as small as a 4-rotor quadcopter that you may purchase at a big retailer, or drones that have 10-foot wingspans that can fly for hours at a time. Well, right now you can go into your big box retailer or use your app on your phone and you can buy a drone with some incredible capabilities, like flying 6 to 10 miles away from you. And during this process, there are a couple things you're not going to be told. The first one is you're not going to be told that FAA is the regulator. So while we may assume, within Washington and the Beltway and within our associations that everyone understands FAA is the regulator, most people purchasing a drone won't understand that because they haven't been exposed to the FAA. They're not given the do's and don'ts of how to operate a drone safely, and they're not furnished with best safety practices. So that's what's missing in this entire equation. But look, there is some good news, and the good news is this, is that some of the latest generation of unmanned vehicles or uncrewed vehicles have some really exciting safety technologies built into them. And so that kind of serves as a tad bit of an equalizer. The next thing we found is that change is far easier to bring to a new industry than a mature one. And you kind of wonder why, and it's this. In a new industry, there's less inertia. And that means sides haven't been taken. People haven't made up their mind on what they want to do. A full culture has not been embedded into the UAS industry yet. So that's why the research showed us that. Next, we have to talk about testing and licensure. And we determined in our research that these are key. And our research involved looking across various portions of DOT, looking across various industries, and asking the question, why have these practices been successful and why have they been sustainable? And what we find is all of these implementations rely on testing and licensure. And especially when it comes to UAS, what came out of our research is this. You can have testing and licensure, but they need to support a broader safety framework. And that means starting from the first time you pick up a UAS to the time you maybe get involved in package delivery. So you need to have a broader framework. And they also need to scale with the complexity of the aircraft or the flight operation. And we'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. The next thing that we looked at was SMS. And we said, well, who needs to be involved in SMS? And what our research shows is that every user needs to be at least introduced to SMS, but only a few companies need a full program. So just to step back, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, there's nothing in this research that says everyone needs SMS, and we'll talk about why they don't. But what it says is, as a building block to a career, to a company, you need to be introduced to portions of SMS. And so once you establish these good habits at the start of a career, you're in a good place. But at some point, when you ask, well, who needs SMS? You have to take a measurement. And that measurement either is in number of aircraft produced, the technological complexity of the aircraft, or really the complexity of the mission. And we offer a framework, and we'll talk about that in 2 slides, that says these are the checkpoints which may indicate various levels of SMS need to be applied. Next, one of the surprising things we found is that SMS can be aligned to 4 unique industry segments. I think one of the common perceptions is that the industry is so diverse, there's so many different users, so many different companies use uncrewed systems that you can't put your arms around segments, but using data from NASA, data from the previous ENO report on the regulatory structure of the UAS industry, looking at the fine work that the DAC has done, looking at the work that the UAST or the Unmanned Aircraft Safety Team has done, it shows that there are actually 4 unique segments in the industry. And the last part of this, one of the key takeaways, and I think it's the good news that we found in this report, and it's this: existing DOT resources can make the job of implementing safety culture and SMS far easier for the FAA, because very, very few items need to be developed from scratch. In fact, if you look across the DOT, across all the modes, and you look at the portfolio on SMS and safety culture, you'll find courses, you'll find accredited training, you'll find certification courses, you'll find licensure exams, you'll find reference materials, workbooks, training curriculum. It's a really long list, but what it says is a lot of the resources and a lot of the tools that the regulator needs and the industry needs are already turnkey. Next slide. So I want to spend a few minutes right now talking about what I think are really the 2 greatest contributions that this report makes on the National UAS Policy Dialogue. And it's something that I haven't seen anybody else successfully accomplish so far, and maybe no one else was asked to do it. But the first thing we were able to do by doing the research, doing the interviews, looking at the purchase path that a typical company or drone user goes through, is that we were able to put together an integrated licensing and testing structure to support safety culture and SMS. And you're probably asking, Ken, well, what does that mean? Let me illustrate that with an example. So in traditional aviation, there is a pathway from student pilot all the way to airline transport pilot. And this pathway includes an individual or an organization working to attain privileges such as flying with passengers, operating aircraft with many engines, flying in the clouds, or even piloting for an airline. And so your path from the cockpit of a Cessna 150 to the cockpit of an Airbus A380 for one of the world's largest airlines is spelled out to you from A to Z. But when you look at the UAS industry, there's really no pathway from A to Z. So if I'm a drone hobbyist, frankly, I don't know what I need to know if I want to fly for a package delivery service someday. That pathway is not apparent in the current structure. I don't know what's expected of me of safety if I fly a really complex aircraft. So that would be an aircraft that uses something called FPV, or first person view, which is a pair of goggles that a user would wear to give themselves the perspective that a pilot would have if they were actually inside that vehicle, or even autonomously following waypoints. So how that relates to safety is so far unwritten, but we think it can be. The chart that you're looking at right now, it outlines the system that I'm talking about, and it outlines career progression with the complexity of an aircraft and the resulting privileges that are granted to an individual. So when you read this chart from top to bottom displays career progression. So it starts out in the upper left-hand corner as a hobbyist looking at a career, and then it progresses to the lower line, which shows you what you would do and need to accomplish if you wanted to be, for instance, a package delivery pilot. If you read it from left to right, it displays regulatory requirements, so testing and licensure. And if you meet these, it shows how you accrue increasing operating and airspace privilege access. Again, it's telling you how you go from being a Cessna 150 pilot, student pilot, to an airline transport pilot. And that's a close approximation. So this is an integrated framework, and this framework is not just aviation focused. It's actually a framework that's been developed with other industries as well. So this, if there is a template, this could be a template for going from point A to Z with any career that takes you from ab initio skills to professional skills. Next slide, please. And this final graphic we're going to look at, this explains what I think is the report's other contribution to the national dialogue, which is a scaled safety management system for the industry. And you ask, well, why is that important? Well, right now, only a few commercial operators and manufacturers may be required to use SMS, or safety management systems. And that's largely done on a case-by-case basis. Using this framework, it standardizes SMS across the industry, and it takes away this case-by-case decision-making. And we'd like to think that that's a win for the FAA in streamlining safety processes. It's a win for organizations that are looking for an understandable regulatory path on safety and understanding what they need to know as they grow bigger and they aspire to bigger things. Finally, this is a win for the public because SMS has been proven to make transportation safer. Now, one of the things our research highlighted is that there are common characteristics among users in the industry, and it allows them to be organized into 4 groups. So if you look on the left side of this chart, you'll see the 4 groups that we've identified, again, using data from NASA, from the FAA, from the Drone Advisory Committee, to name a few. So in the upper left-hand corner, we have a user group that are recreational and non-commercial operators that are not equipped with FPV or electronic path technologies. And as you work your way to the bottom, you'll see in that 4th and final box, manufacturers and operators that are either producing or operating type certified aircraft or producing in excess of about 1,000 aircraft a year. So in all of this, in all of these groupings, what it's important to understand is that SMS carries with it a very high administrative burden. And that makes it a disincentive and perhaps impractical for many organizations. And this chart and this framework tries to identify at what level and what measures it starts to make sense because you've reached that size. So again, there is no SMS safety SMS mandate for the industry. But what there is a recognition that certain groups require additional levels of SMS. And again, for the hobbyists and for the recreational users, all they need to do is start possessing and operating in accordance with some basic safety standards, which in fact is one of the key tenets of safety management systems. And if you look at the other 2 categories in the report, we even talk about the tweeners. So people and organizations that are not recreational, but not large scale manufacturers. And next slide, please. And the final thing I want to talk about are some of the recommendations in the report. So we have 12 areas of recommendations in the report. They're listed here, but I just want to focus on 4 of these today. And the first area I want to focus on is standards. So our research shows that there is a large body of standards being developed by the industry. And many of these have the potential to positively impact safety. Unfortunately, the FAA has incorporated very few of these into regulation, perhaps only 7. And our recommendations on standards propose to create a body of these, a body of standards that are recognized by the FAA that can serve as guideposts to the industry to show the industry what are the safe ways to do things. And that's the role of standards. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the commercial sales of UAS components and our recommendations in this area. As we discussed at the opening, I can become a drone pilot and not know who the FAA is, not know what my safety requirements are, and not know how I'm going to go from being a brand new drone pilot to perhaps a package delivery pilot. And one of the things that we found in our research is that having knowledge of these regulatory requirements, having knowledge of the regulator, needs to formally start at the point of sale. So when you purchase that drone, you leave that store, or you leave your front porch with the box, or you leave that factory with a very strong idea of the regulatory path that you need to take next. And that, in effect, that puts safety at the ground floor of the entire purchasing process. I spoke a little bit earlier about the UAS safety team, which is an absolutely amazing collaborative group between the government and between the industry. It's a public-private partnership. And what this organization does, it analyzes data, it identifies risks in that data, and then it comes together and collaboratively works to identify best practices, all within the realm of uncrewed aviation. And the research shows us that the UAST can mirror the incredible accomplishments of its fellow organization, the CAST, the Commercial Airline Safety Team, with support. But that support is really measured in dollars, and it's going to be measured in FTEs. And finally, I want to just touch, as a last thing, promoting safety culture. To be clear, the research shows that a mandate is needed on safety culture and SMS, and most likely in the form of some sort of congressional action at this point. Because without it, safety culture and SMS are going to languish, or they're going to be delivered in a one-size-fits-all manner after the next accident. And that's not just stated within the realm of aviation. That has what happened to the power industry, the small bus industry, and there are other industries that you can read about in this research report that waited, but then a trigger accident occurred, and that led to a one-size-fits-all mandate. And I think the message is, if we start putting together an organized approach for the UAS industry, that will actually get a safety culture and SMS programs that actually fit the industry, that are designed for the industry, and that have the industry support. And that will go a long way to greater safety achievements and a safer industry. So Paul, with that, that concludes my presentation, and I'm more than happy to take any kind of questions you might have.
Excellent, and thank you, Ken. Really appreciate that. And I'm going to leave the recommendation slide up as kind of a discussion format for us, but you should be able to see all of our faces, and that we're going to spend the next 20 minutes or so running through some questions. There's a few of them that have come in already, and I'm going to take a moderator's prerogative and ask some of those as we go through. So the first is one that I think is kind of very, very broad and kind of talking about the purpose of this, is that the UAS industry already has a fairly decent safety record, right? I mean, that's pretty objective, and I think the report talks about that. So the question though is why are we calling for safety culture and SMS? And is this something of trying to fix something that isn't broke?
Okay. So that's the $10 million question here, Paul. Let me start by saying and agreeing with you that the UAS industry does have an enviable safety record. But the next question I would ask is that, does the data we're collecting support that statement, that it has an enviable safety record? Or is this more through anecdotal evidence that says it's safe? And one of the things that is the crux of all this is to make answering that question objective based on data. And we can't do that now. And I'm going to touch that point in just a minute. But the point I wanted to make is when you take a look at the other industries we talked about, when we talked about power, when we talked about rail, light rail, healthcare, each of those industries really has, I want to say, like 3 hallmarks that says it has a robust safety culture and robust safety management systems. And it's that they make education readily accessible, all the way from a new entry-level individual all the way to a professional, so that there's a robust body of education. The next hallmark of having a strong industry safety and SMS culture is that data is used and that data is collected. Right now in the UAS industry, we are collecting data, but we don't know if we're collecting the right data. And these aircraft can produce hundreds of data fields per second. And are we analyzing the data to predict and understand risk, and then to give our future actions some sort of reference point and figure out what we do next. And the answer is, in all but a few places, we're not doing that. So that doesn't exist within UAS. And the last part is there a licensing framework? So other industries have shown that a licensing framework is a critical component of that robust safety culture and that robust SMS combination. And so those three keys are actually not present and are not permeating the UAS industry. So getting back to what you asked, yes, it's safe, but we have to understand why it's safe, and we have to be able to predict how it'll be safer in the future. So that's why we're talking about it.
Got it. So next question is about the difference between recreational users and commercial users, right? And I think the report's pretty clear that we delineate between the two, but at the same time, the report does say, that this kind of safety culture and even SMS can apply to all UAS users. So can you just explain a little bit about, the difference between the two, and is our proposal putting too much of a burden on the recreational users?
So from beginning to end, we recognize one thing, that if you put too much of a burden on the recreational users, they're not going to get involved. And it wouldn't make sense to take a program like SMS, which has very large and formidable administrative requirements, and tell that to Ken Dunlap, I'm a big recreational user, and say, Ken, you need an SMS program the next time you go fly one of your hobbyist airplanes. That would disincentivize people. Rather, what this report is trying to do, it's trying to incentivize by giving just the right amount of information that a person can say, okay, I know this is my foundational information, and I can use that to take myself from student drone operator to commercial drone operator, to the package delivery operator. And the other thing is that one of the things that was clear, I mean, we visited recreational flying fields, we looked at recreational safety codes. One of the things in this segment of the industry is this. Again, they have a strong track record, very strong safety record. Is there the data to support that? No. It's, roughly anecdotal evidence. Does there need to be hard data? Probably not. But what we need to understand is, in the recreational area, safety tends to be transactional. And what do I mean by that? So if you go and join a CBO, a community-based organization, you will literally check a box saying, I understand that this organization has a safety code and a safety culture. And you do that maybe once a year, maybe every 2 years, every 3 years, depends how long you're renewing your membership for. And then the other part is, when you go fly at a FRIA, so the FAA recognized hobbyist zones, your safety over there is also transactional. You may check a box with the application sheet that you got from that club to join and say, I understand the safety rules. And so what this report is saying is that transactional safety is not good enough. It needs to be practiced every time you decide and have the intent to fly. And so for the recreational users, we're saying, look, let's take safety away from being a poster on a wall someplace at that flying field to being something that you possess in your hands and something that you might just look at every time you go fly. Because what that'll do is that'll educate you on the safe ways of doing things, but will also say you are part of a bigger framework. And that's what we're trying to do, Paul.
Got it. A couple questions on that related to that last point is about the first-person view or FPV drones. Can you talk a little bit more about the proposal there and how that relates to permissions for recreational FPV drones and how that relates to the FRIA zones and those different restrictions?
Yeah, so let me just first start by reminding everybody what FPV is. That's first person view. That's where the operator is going to wear a set of goggles that's going to give them the view as the aircraft sees it as it flies. The requirements are outside of the requirements are that you need to have an observer with you. Now, what complicates matters is that many of these FPV aircraft have the capability of transmitting a signal, maybe 6 miles. Some of the new software that's come out in the last 2 months has been updated to actually increase that to 10 miles. So you've got a vehicle that an operator is going to operate just wearing goggles. And then you ask yourself, okay, the technology will probably save some people from doing some things that don't make sense. One of the latest versions of FPV has the ADS-B transponder or receiver in it, and it'll show in your goggles, hey, aircraft flying here. And you say, oh, there's aircraft flying there. Maybe the person I'm flying with didn't see it, and I didn't hear it, so I'm going to go land. So it's great technology. But what that FPV operator doesn't have right now is training to say, okay, this is, and these are your safety responsibilities if you're going to go under the goggles and fly 6 to 10 miles away. Because in fact, there's nothing inherently safe with flying that vehicle 6 to 10 miles away, if you're just looking at it from a safety and technology perspective. But it becomes unsafe when the user doesn't know what they're doing and they don't understand. So what this report proposes is no changes for the current CBO operators. So CBO operators inside the FRIA, they have a set of rules that they follow when they fly FPV, and as long as they're maintaining their flight within that FRIA, that works. But where it doesn't work is if you're going to start flying outside of the FRIA and you're going to start flying into airspace that you may have a very strong chance of encountering an aircraft. So again, I mean, if you look at what this report calls for, very little changes in the CBO area. But if you want to go outside that FRIA, you need to start understanding your safety responsibilities, demonstrating your safety responsibilities through testing. And the research shows not only is it a good idea, but other industries do that as technology increases and the user will either experience higher risk or perhaps subject other individuals to higher risk that are not part of the operation. I hope that answers your question.
I hope so. Yeah, we can. Yeah, we'll move on to the next one here. So this question is about these safety standards and how they might apply to other concerns associated with UAS operations. For example, the questioner says the prevention of unwelcome intrusions into personal privacy, homes, backyards, or prevention of adverse impacts such as noise or collisions to bird populations. Does the safety culture that we're talking about expand beyond just the basics, and does it include some of these other concerns?
Well, so that's a yes and no question. So when you look at safety culture and you look at SMS, those are long-term structural programs for an industry. So we can implement safety culture and SMS tomorrow. Congress can do that. And it will take years for that to actually, be evidenced out in the wild, that people change the way they do things, that manufacturers make safer aircraft. And so it's not a quick thing, but it does offer some very interesting things. If we go down the road of safety management, we're going to start collecting data. The regulator is going to start insisting on data, and we can use that data to understand where it's safe to fly and where it's not safe to fly. One of the big incidents of the last 2 years, there's a wildlife refuge out in California, and at that refuge, what the law says right now is you have to fly over a designated wildlife refuge at over 2,000 feet. Unfortunately, the operator chose not to and killed literally hundreds of animals. And we don't want that to happen. So, data can help highlight those wrong things that people are doing with the aircraft. Is it going to stop someone from flying a drone in front of my window today? If a person has ill intent, it's not going to stop them. But will it help the industry instill in people good habits um, respect for people, we think it will.
Very good. So a couple questions about kind of next steps for these recommendations. Can you just talk a little bit about interest in our supporters in Congress or the FAA, and basically, who and where do different stakeholders stand on the report's recommendations?
So one of the wonderful things about this, we have spoken to a number of the NGOs in Washington and briefed them on this report. We've briefed FAA on it. We'll be submitting it to the DAC shortly. And to my knowledge, it's only been positive feedback. Now, I authored the report, so, I don't want to be the person that only hears good things. But there's been a lot of good things said about the fine work that Eno did and what the Aviation Working Group is trying to accomplish. Because again, for people on the line, this is one small part of a larger project that Eno is doing through the Aviation Working Group to figure out how UAS can be successfully integrated into the NAS. So when you talk about next steps, there's certainly some more questions that need to be answered. But when it comes to safety culture and SMS, there needs to be kind of a gut check on this. And I'll tell you why. Because if we go down the path of voluntary SMS and voluntary safety culture initiatives, what do we know? We know that in other industries, from the time someone mentions the word, hey, let's do this voluntarily as a regulator, it takes almost 10 years before you'll start seeing the first NPRM, the first rule. The airport industry is a prime example of this. They've been working with the FAA almost 10 years on this. And, it may only be towards the end of this year, beginning of next year, we're going to start seeing something in the way of SMS for the airport industry. Should you choose to do this involuntarily, should it be encouraged or mandated by Congress? That's still a pretty long regulatory calendar. If we look at what happened right after the Colgan Air tragedy, for a lot of the SMS requirements, it's taken almost 6 years from beginning to end to get those in place. But that is far faster than 10 years, and it gives you far more of assurance. So that's why, we certainly have made recommendations to Congress to say, now is probably the time to do it, but we need that trigger from you. And I think if we continue arguing and painting over what that trigger is going to be for these two standards, we're going to get a trigger handed to us. And there's no doubt about that. And I think everybody from the industry would agree, far better to control and chart your own destiny than to have someone else do it for you. And far better to use a system that other industries use, that other industries are familiar with, than maybe get one that's maybe based on knee-jerk reactions to a tragedy.
It's a great point, and not one that one that I think will resonate with a lot of folks. We have just a minute or two left, and Ken, before we close out, I wanted to see if there's anything that perhaps you were expecting to get asked and didn't, or any kind of closing thoughts before we wrap up the webinar today.
Yeah. So that's an interesting question. So I thought that when I mentioned the words SMS, safety management systems, that there would be 50 people that said, you just want the UAS industry to look like the airline industry, Ken. You just want to do that. One of the important things to remember in all this is we are seeing message fatigue, right? And it's message fatigue that is affecting the UAS stakeholders who are the core of all this, and which is the audience that needs to understand what is being shared with them in terms of safety culture and SMS. Because when you look where these conversations typically occur, it's in a room of aviation stakeholders. And so naturally, the one aviation stakeholder group that has deep familiarity with SMS is going to be the airline industry. And so outwardly, it may sound as if the airline industry is trying to mandate something that was mandated on them onto the UAS industry. And what I would encourage everybody to do is to step back and look at DOT's sector-wide commitment to safety, culture, and SMS. The Secretary has published that for at least the last 6 or 7 years in her or his report on safety. The FAA is deeply committed to that as well. And if you look at all the other industries that are out there, they're looking at it. I think the perspective around those tables needs to be, everybody else is doing it. Why can't we learn from them, and why can't we do it? Rather than think, hey, this is the airline industry, trying to squelch innovation, trying to stop us from doing something which causes them to have to share airspace with us. And that's where I kind of wish that some of these discussions would go, Paul.
Great, that's a great point, and a really good way to end the discussion today. I want to thank everyone for joining. Really appreciate the questions that have come in. We'll be following up with a few of you after this. And again, thanks everyone for attending, and we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Center.